Chapter 3. The Curtains. Mr. James Denton's greatest love in life was books, old ones most of all. His collection grew bigger and bigger every year, but he lived in his aunt's house, and she was not very happy about this. Mr. Denton was in London one day to buy furniture for the new house, which he and his aunt were building, and he was on his way to a shop to choose the curtains. His way took him, quite by chance, past one of the best bookshops in London, and he could not stop himself going in, just for a quick look, as he told himself. He was just walking round the shop, looking at all the different books, when he noticed a small collection of books on the part of England that he came from. Warwickshire. He spent the next half an hour looking through these, and finally decided to buy one that really interested him, called The Diary of Mr. Pointer, I-710. He paid for the book, and then, looking at his watch, he realized that he had very little time before his train back to Warwickshire left, and he had to rush to the station. He just caught the train. That night, his aunt questioned him about his trip to London, and was very interested to hear about the furniture which was going to arrive soon. Her nephew described everything in detail, but still she was not satisfied. "And what about the curtains, James?" she asked. "Did you go to—" Suddenly James remembered. Oh dear," he said. "Dial's the one thing I missed. I am so sorry. You see, I was on my way there when, quite by chance, I passed Robin's." "Not Robin's the bookshop, I hope," cried his aunt. "Don't tell me you've bought more horrible old books, James." "Well, only one," he said, feeling a bit guilty. "And it's a very interesting one. A diary of someone who used to live not far from here." But he could see that his aunt was not really listening. "You can't go to London again before next Thursday," she was saying. "And really, James, until we decide on the curtains, there's nothing we can do." Luckily, she decided to go to bed soon after that, and James was left alone with his new book, which he read until the early hours of the morning. He found this diary, with its stories of everyday life at Duck's Tune, very interesting. The next day was Sunday. After church, James and his aunt sat in the living room together. "Is this the old book that made you forget my curtains?" asked his aunt, picking it up. "Well, it doesn't look very good. The Diary of Mr. Pointer. Huh." But she opened the book and looked at a few pages. Suddenly, much to his surprise, she began to show some interest. "Look at this, James," she said. "Isn't it lovely?" It was a small piece of paper pinned to one of the pages of the diary. On it was a beautiful drawing, made up of curving lines, which somehow caught the eye. "Well, why don't we get it copied for the curtains, if you like it so much?" he suggested, hoping that she would forgive him for his bad memory of the day before in London. His aunt agreed, and the very next day, James took the piece of paper to a company in the nearest town who agreed to copy it and make it into curtains. About a month later, James was called in to inspect the work and was extremely pleased with the result. "Was it a difficult job?" he asked the manager. "Not too difficult, sir. But, to tell you the truth, the artist who did the work was very unhappy about it. He said there was something bad in the drawing, sir." James was thoughtful, but still he chose the colors for the curtains, and then returned home. A few weeks later, the curtains were ready, and a man came to hang them in the several rooms of the new house, one of which was James's bedroom. That night he found that he could not stop looking at them, and, although it was a still night, he was almost sure that the curtains were moving and that someone was watching him from behind them. He told himself that this was impossible, and not to be so stupid. He explained to himself that the effect was caused by the curving lines on the curtains, which looked just like long, curling black hair. The next day, a friend of James's came to stay, and after dinner they sat up late, talking and laughing. At last they decided to go to bed, and James showed his friend to the guest room, which was just along from his own. James, though, did not want to go to bed immediately and sat in the chair by the fire in his room, reading. He fell asleep for a few minutes, and when he woke, he realized that something was in the room with him. Putting out his hand, he felt something covered in hair and thought it was his dog, who always followed him everywhere. "How did you get in here? I thought I left you downstairs," he said, looking down. To his horror, he found it was not his little dog, but something almost human. He jumped and screamed, and as he did, the face of the thing came up towards him. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, only hair. He screamed again and rushed to the door, but was so frightened that he could not get it open. He felt the thing touch his back and start to tear at his shirt. At last the door flew open, and he rushed to his friend's room, terrified and breathing hard. The next morning, early, James went away to the seaside for a few days to try to forget about his horrible experience. He took with him the diary of Mr. Pointer. He wanted to read it again carefully to find out anything he could about the pattern pinned onto the page. When he turned to that part of the book, he found that there were several pieces of paper stuck one on top of the other. He carefully pulled off the first two and found this story, written by Mr. Pointer in 1707. Old Mr. Casbury of Accrington told me this day of young Sir Everard Charlotte, at that time a student of University College. The young man drank too much and broke the law many times, but because he was from an important family, the university never did anything about it. He used to wear his hair very long and curling down his neck, and he wore unusual, colorful clothes. His behavior made his father very unhappy. One day, they found young Sir Everard dead in his room, with all his hair pulled out. No one could explain why or how he died, but the strangest tiling was that, the day after he died, the body disappeared completely, leaving only a pile of long, curling black hair on the floor of his room. His father kept some of this hair and had drawings made of it, part of which I have pinned to this page. This is the strange story behind the curtains. Before he returned home, James Denton ordered his servants to take them all down and burn them. Chapter 4. The Flies. If you go to the end of the road, past Colin's house, on the left, you will see a field with some old fruit trees in it. A little house used to be there, where a man called Davis lived. He was a very quiet man who seemed to have enough money to live on. He didn't work on the farms, but he always went to town on market days. One day, a young man came back from market with him. The young man was pale and thin, and he didn't speak very much. He lived with Mr. Davis, and nobody knew if he helped with the housework or if Mr. Davis was his teacher. But people talked and wondered why they were always walking together, early and late, up in the hills and down in the woods. They suspected that the two men were playing with magic and were plotting something terrible. Once a month, when the moon was full, they went up to a place on the hill where there are piles of old stones and rocks, and they stayed up there all night. Someone once asked Mr. Davis why he went to such a dark, lonely place in the middle of the night. Mr. Davis smiled and replied, "I love old places. They remind me of the past, and the air is beautiful on a summer's night. You can see all the countryside for miles around in the moonlight. But Mr. Davis's young friend interrupted rudely. We don't want other people near us. We just want to talk to each other. Mr. Davis seemed annoyed at his young friend's rudeness, and he politely explained, people say that there are bodies under those old stones, the bodies of dead soldiers. I know farmers sometimes find old bones and pots when they are working in the fields around here. I'd like to know more about how those people lived and who their gods were. I think they probably practiced magic. Then, one morning in September, something terrible happened. A farm worker had to go up to the top of the hill, to the woods, very early, when it was still dark. In the distance, he saw a shape that looked like a man in the early morning fog. As he came nearer, he saw that it was a man. It was Mr. Davis's friend, dead, hanging from a tree. Near his feet was a knife, covered in blood. The poor farm worker was terrified and ran back down the hill to the villagey. He woke up some of the villagers to tell them about the terrible sight, and some men went back up the hill with a horse to bring down the body. They also immediately sent a young boy to Mr. Davis's house to see if he was at home, because, of course, they suspected that he was the murderer. When they cut down the young man's body from the tree, they were surprised to see the clothes he was wearing were all black, like the clothes that vicars used to wear many centuries ago. When the men's horse came near the tree and the dead young man, it screamed and tried to run away, but the men were able to hold it, and they finally got back to the village with the body across the terrified horse's back. In the village, they found the young boy standing in the main street, with several women standing around him. He was as white as paper and would not say a word. When the men tried to move on towards Mr. Davis's house, the horse again became very frightened. It stopped in the road and would not move. Then suddenly it turned and tried to run, and the body of the dead young man fell off its back onto the road. The horse could smell blood. They carried the young man's body to Mr. Davis's house, and when they opened the door, they saw what the poor young boy had seen. There, on the long kitchen table, was the body of Mr. Davis. Tied around his eyes was a black handkerchief, and his hands were tied behind his back. His chest was cut open from top to bottom, and his heart was gone. It was an awful sight. The men ran outside for some fresh air. The smell of death in that room was so terrible. Later, they put the young man's body next to Mr. Davis's, and they looked carefully around the house. Why were these two men dead? How did they die? In one of the cupboards, they found a small green bottle of strong medicine, often used to put people to sleep. I think that young man gave Mr. Davis some of this stuff to put him to sleep, one man suggested, looking at the bottle, and then killed him. Goodness knows why. Perhaps he needed Davis's heart for his magic. Then later, perhaps he was sorry about murdering his friend and went up the hill and killed himself. Well, the villagers decided that the two dead men could not lie in the graveyard near the church. They never came to church, and they didn't believe in God, they said. They believed in unnatural things, in magic. So 12 men covered the two bodies in black and took them to a place outside the village. There they dug a big hole, threw the bodies into it, and covered them with stones. People say that horses don't like going near that place even today, and there is a strange kind of light there. One day, sometime later, some people walking along the road found a pool of blood across it. In the blood there were fat black flies, feeding. One man went to get some water, and they washed the blood away, but the flies flew up into the air like a dark cloud and flew towards Mr. Davis's house. The villagers decided that no one should live in that house anymore, so they set fire to it. The house burnt down completely, but for a long time, people said that they often saw Mr. Davis and the young man standing at night when the moon was full in the road near the burnt house on the hill. Only the flies live there now. Perhaps it is only the flies who know why those two men played with magic and why they died the way they did.
The end.